Cheers to the Confederate Republican Europe. That was an exclamation here in this hall 191 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Friedrich Ebert Foundation, welcome on this historical location and also online at our live stream. My name is Ellen Diehl and I am the head of our regional office for Rhineland-Palatinate and Saarland located in Mainz. The Hambach Castle is the place of the Hambach Festival of 1832. The festival was an important milestone in the German and also European democracy movement. It has also shaped the development of social democracy. 30,000 people came here together. A complete generation of young people met here from all over Europe, Poland, France, Germany, Great Britain. On the terrace of the castle, the Polish flag was put up, and from the tower waved the German flag. We are happy to welcome all of you here, but I want to mention especially our 23 young people who discussed a lot of our workshop yesterday and today in the morning. They are from Poland, France, Hungary, Czech Republic and Germany. It's great to have you all here. Thanks that you are here. 191 years ago, the people fought for freedom of speech, freedom of press, gender equality and a united nation, and also for an alliance of free nations in Europe. Since then, it's a symbol for democracy, freedom and peace. Even here at Hambach Castle, right-wing populists are trying to take over this symbolic site for their purposes, pretending they are the real democrats. They have been organizing demonstrations and marches to the castle and so on, but we have to respond to this. With our Hambach Democracy Dialogue, we are showing that Hambach Castle is a place for debates and discussions for the future of a progressive European democracy. And that's why Hambach Castle today is a symbol not only of the history of German democracy, but also of Europe's idols and history. So my dear colleague Christiane Kesper, who is the director of our EU office in Brussels, will introduce us to our goals to this conference. Thank you and see you later.
Thank you, Ellen, and ladies and gentlemen, dear members of European Parliament, distinguished guests, friends of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. As Ellen said, my name is Christiane Kesper. I'm the director of our EU Brussels office. It's an honor and a privilege to me to welcome you all to our third Hambach Democracy Dialogue. Every year, we bring together progressive European politicians, democracy activists, researchers, and young people from across Europe to discuss the future of European democracy. Let me just start with some words on Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. So we have been working on European and international affairs for almost 100 years. Even our EU Brussels office is this year 50 years old. The Friedrich Ebert Stiftung is a non-profit organization committed to the values of social democracy. We are the oldest of the German political foundations, were established 1925 after the death of Friedrich Ebert, the first democratically elected president of Germany. Our objective is and was to promote civic education. What are we doing else? We provide policy advice regarding strategies on the socio-ecological transformation of societies. We support scientific research, and with over 106 countries worldwide, we support high-level international dialogue and promote democracy by supporting free trade union and civil society and, of course, progressive parties. For us, trade unions are a central and focal point in the democratic transition of every society. Finally, we provide scholarships for excellent, critical, and politically active students and junior scientists. With our worldwide leaders training for young people, we develop and strengthen networks of young leaders whose decision will shape tomorrow's world. So very much welcome also for all our younger participants. Coming back to our today's conference, so being a symbol not only of Germany's history of democracy, but also for European unity and democracy movements in general, we, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, want to follow the tradition of Hambach Castle and contribute to the further development of our joint European democracy. The Hambach Democracy Dialogue started in 2021, and now after 2 years of pandemic, we are really happy to continue this progressive tradition and European vision with all of you in the next 2 days of our conference here at Hambach Castle. At this international forum, we want to connect democracy experts from Europe and beyond with members of European Parliament and progressive politicians, some MEPs just arrived from the plenary session in Strasbourg, so I would like to welcome you really very heartily, and in particular Jens Geier, who still is missing. So you have to tell him what I said. He's the head of the SPD group, I think you know that, in the European Parliament. And his honor is that he, together with FES President Martin Schulz, had the idea to create such a European conference on the future of democracy just here at Hambach Castle. Unfortunately, Martin Schulz, for personal reasons, can't be with us today, but he asked me to send his best regards, and he already committed himself to be here next year, so hopefully. At this really beautiful venue, we would like to listen to your ideas and proposals on how we can defend and strengthen democracy and European values 1 year ahead of the next European election. We want to discuss about new ways how to enhance social democracy and European integration, and we want to give the opportunity, of course, for networking and exchanging ideas between like-minded thinkers and experts. Our main topic this year is defending democracy in times of multiple crises, and my dear colleague Johanna Lutz from our FES regional office in Vienna on the future of democracy will elaborate on the content of this year's conference and the sessions we will have today. But before I hand over, I really wish us all a rewarding and enjoyable time. I hope for fruitful discussions. And I want to thank our FES conference team, who is hiding there in the corner, combined of 3 FES offices, Mainz, Vienna, and Brussels, for really the excellent work they have done in planning and organizing this international conference. And with that, I hand over to Johanna.
Thanks. So I'm the third FES person you will have to listen to now, just really briefly, and then we can really start. My name is Johanna Lutz. I'm the director of the FES regional office that we have in Vienna called Democracy of the Future. And we work on democracy and the rule of law in the entire OSCE region. I'm really glad that we are here. Christiane already thanked the team that's hiding back there. We work together on this conference with 3 offices, and you can engage with them, or if you have any questions, ask them. And last year, we also prepared the whole team of the Vienna office, I think 4 or 5 people. We are here, and last year we couldn't come because half of us got sick with COVID, the other half with hand-foot-mouth disease, and that's why it's really great that this time we finally made it. And you know, usually I'm very optimistic or even enthusiastic about all things democracy, and it's my job after all. But I think this year, like especially 1 year before the election, we are in a quite challenging situation, I would say. We find ourselves in these multiple crises. We are just still digesting, or while we were still digesting the aftermaths of the pandemic, we suddenly had a war in Europe, and that was something that, as a this post-war generation, as Tony Judd coined it, it was really a Zeitenwende. It was really a breaking point, and several crises ensued. We found out that Western Europe was quite dependent on energy, which caused an energy crisis. Now we are in the cost of living crisis on top of everything, and I think it's really hard on people, and it really does something with people's minds and well-being. And during this conference, that we would really like to discuss with all of you what effects all these ongoing crises are having or could have still on democracy. And we prioritized 3 topics, and these seemed really important for us from a social democratic perspective. So today we will be discussing whether we are currently witnessing a struggle between autocracies and democracies, because we can hear this narrative or this framing, I would say, of the current geopolitical reorientation, especially from many influential American and European politicians and think tankers and so on. And we were wondering in our offices, is this narrative helpful and will it actually be beneficial for democracies? Or are there any alternative frames that might be more productive for democracies to really thrive? And I'm looking forward to all your insights. And tomorrow we'll have a session that focuses on the impact that rising economic inequality has on democracy. And I think I saw Olaf here, Olaf Böhnke from the Alliance of Democracies, just I think a month ago. So you published this Democracy Perception Index that surveys around 75% of the entire world's population. And there again, the result was that the danger to democracy that is seen as the most crucial one is inequality, economic inequality. And we will discuss all the mechanisms and correlations and so behind it. And because it's quite complex, we will do this in this World Cafe format and discuss 3 sub-questions on this. And then tomorrow, the third big topic will be the rise of the far right in Europe. And we'll be discussing why that actually should concern us and what the strategies could be, or we could develop against this rise. We have also 2 very distinguished keynote speeches, one by Eva Illouz on emotions and populism, and one by François Hollande tomorrow. And he will share his views on the biggest challenges for Europe. So I'm very much looking forward to these really packed 2.5 days. And now I would like to introduce to you the person who will guide us through all this conference. Meet Ivana Dragicevic, our moderator for the next 2 days. She's from Croatia and is currently editor-at-large at N1 Television, an exclusive CNN affiliate for the Adria-Balkans region. She's also currently a guest fellow at the IWM in Vienna, and she has vast experience on European and international affairs. She's won numerous awards, and we're really happy to have your expertise with us today.
Not to lose time. Thank you so much to Friedrich Ebert. Thank you to this nice introduction, and I have a very bad role today to say something before our first keynote speech, because the person who will give the first keynote speech, a food for thought, is a person who knows a lot about emotions. Eva Illouz is a sociologist, a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I've told you just a couple of minutes ago, I've read all of her books that are dealing with, I will call it matters of heart. Because in times of crisis, people fear, people don't trust, people tend to close themselves, or people tend to over-exaggerate their emotions. So the recent book of Professor Illouz talks about the emotional life of populism, how fear, disgust, resentment, and love undermine democracy. Populism as emotional politics is not something of our age, of our time, something that is challenging us in the last decade or more. And I want to quote Professor Illouz before. I wanted to quote Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes, but you all read it and you all know what he thought about reason and emotions and language and how things differ. So somewhere on that track, Eva Illouz, in Consuming the Romantic Utopia, wrote, culture, thus, is a matter of shared meanings. But it is not only that, it is also one of the ways in which exclusion, inequality, and power structures are maintained and reproduced. Are we still living that age, or are we experiencing something new? I'm really honored. I'm a little bit shaking because I love your work, and thank you for, please take your pens ready, take your iPads ready, and write what Professor Illouz will say. The floor is yours. Please, oh, sorry.
Thank you for this so generous introduction. I couldn't hope for a more generous one. I'm going to start this paper with not an introduction, but just a number of remarks. From 1970 to 2010, there was an extraordinary increase of countries joining democracy. In 2016, though, 96 electoral democracy, there were 96 electoral democracies in the world, and 6 years later, in 2022, there were only 90, 6 years only. During the same period, the number of people who had democratic rights plummeted from 3.9 billion people to 2.3 billion people. So we can say fairly easily that democracy is under the assault of what Francis Fukuyama calls, and many others, nationalist populism, which is a political form which undermines the institutions of democracy from inside, not outside democracy. As political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt have claimed in a very famous book, democracies do not only die through military coups or other such dramatic events. They also die slowly. Populism is the political form taken by this slow death. The second remark is that we live in the midst of what Yasha Monk has called a great experiment. Never before have democratic societies lived in such multicultural and multi-ethnic societies. In 1970, in the UK, less than 1 person out of 25 was born abroad. Today, it is 1 out of 7. A few decades ago, Sweden was one of the most homogeneous countries in the world, whereas today, 1 person out of 5 is from foreign origins. Lots of countries have known the same striking changes. No democracy has actually consciously planned this change to being multi-ethnic and multi-confessional. But all of these countries found themselves with a large population of immigrants who are from other ethnicities and religions. I think populism is largely a reaction to this fact. Not only, obviously, I'm totally aware of the economic underpinnings of populism, but it is also a reaction to that. Populism is an attempt to change the relationship between majorities and the minority group living in their midst. Third remark, socialism, communism, democracy, and populism actually all claim to represent the people. Now, if political ideologies, which are so drastically different from each other, are supposed to represent the same thing, then either only one of them says the truth and the others are lying or mistaken, or more disturbingly, none of them actually represents the people. I think the word people has become a floating signifier, an empty category, whose invocation is enough to legitimize whatever political orientation one claims to have. This means, in turn, perhaps, that we should abandon the notion. The fourth proposition is that deliberative democracy has been based on the assumption of rationality. And we are witnessing the spectacular demise of this assumption. Just to be very short, to explain, deliberative democracy is based on the assumption that the citizen is rational and makes political decisions based on information and self-interest. Now, maybe it's easy for us to imagine how information may become false or incomplete. It's more difficult to envisage the possibility that citizens may well be oblivious, at least more oblivious than we had assumed, to their own self-interest. Berlusconi, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Trump, just to take a few examples, did not contribute to the economic welfare or the health of their voters, yet these voters retained their fierce loyalty to the leader despite the miserable failure of their leadership. So democratic theory is really based on this assumption of rationality. And if it is not true, this constitutes, in my opinion, a serious challenge to the view, to how we should think about democracy. Fifth and final opening remark. It could also well be that many people are not that interested in democracy. This could be for a number of reasons. It could be that democracy does not really work for them. In fact, we know that democracy works much better for some and not so much for others. Or it may well be that they are not for democracy because they don't really know what they do when they choose leaders like Netanyahu, Orban, or Erdogan. And finally, another possibility is that the affirmation of a group identity, of a nation untainted past, of their own ethnic uniqueness are more important to a large sector of citizens than democracy per se. Possibly, what many people now mean by democracy, the power by and for the people, is that it should be for one people only, that is the majority, and that there is now a great struggle over the meaning of democracy because an increasing amount of people want it for them only. So, if democracy is about identity, how should it change our approach to democracy? Jan Werner Müller, one of the most prominent world specialists on populism, has suggested that populism is a permanent shadowy effect of representative democracies. In other words, it accompanies democracy and is not outside of it. And I want to explore this possibility by looking at the case of Israel and ask how democracy becomes undermined from within, really from within. Democracy is not only a matter of rules and procedures, it is also a matter of norms and civic culture. And to uphold these norms, this is my small addition to this, I think you need a certain way of thinking, what in another context, the Nobel Award Danny Kahneman has called slow thinking. You need, in order to uphold democratic norms, you need to process information in a certain way. You need a certain way of relating to your frustration, to your expectation. And mostly, I think, it has to do, this way of thinking, what I call a way of thinking, it has to do with a way of building adequate causal frameworks, how you explain the social world, whether you attribute inequality to flawed redistributive policy or to taxation policies is quite different from attributing it to Jewish bankers, I think. So causal frameworks, how we build them, I think are key to democratic culture. To understand how people come to ignore self-interest and build these flawed causal frameworks, I think we must understand the role of emotions in politics. And I want to focus on one aspect, therefore, of the array of complex mechanisms through which groups of people become robbed of an adequate grasp of their own interest, of an adequate grasp of causal frameworks. They perceive the social world through flawed causal frameworks, that is, false explanation of the social world because they explain it through deep stories. Deep stories are stories that feel true, that are not true, that are repeated, that stick. The expression is not mine, it's the expression by sociologist Arlie Hochschild. And so these deep stories both express emotions as frustration, anger, or envy, and they also amplify them, and more crucially, they give them something like the ring of truth. So politics is not only about information, election, parties, agendas, checks and balances. It is also about an immense amount of emotion circulating in the public sphere in the form of stories. And just to say this very quickly, I think Daniel Kahneman's distinction between two forms of thinking, one slow, one fast, is very crucial here. I'm talking about, of course, fast thinking. Emotions are fast thinking, which you can induce in people by invoking certain words, by presenting information in certain order, by priming, framing, repeating, creating halo effect. All of these have a profound effect in making people pass quick judgment, which rely on something we call intuition and emotions. So, after having said this, let me start and my paper and say that I'm going to focus on what I think are the 4 key emotions of populism: fear, disgust, resentment, and love. And I'm going to claim that these emotions are vectors, have become vectors of the political process. I focus on Israel. I am aware, of course, that Israel has very unique problems and a very unique geography, and yet I think it is paradigmatic of the nationalist and populist political style that has unfolded throughout the world. It is the combination of these 4 emotions and their relentless presence in the political arena that is a characteristic of populist politics. So note that I'm not explaining populism, I'm just trying to characterize it. First, fear. Fear has been a long-standing theme in political theory. Aristotle commended fear because for him it was a good way to obey the law. Montesquieu actually despised fear. He thought it was the emotion of tyrant. And Machiavelli is probably the one that has best justified fear in the political sphere by advising the prince to always make sure that his subjects would fear him. Netanyahu has changed Israeli politics radically. Few democratic leaders have used fear as blatantly as him. Netanyahu did that by mixing the biblical and theological motive of the kind of eternal enemy of the Jews, of Israel, to the motif of the Shoah with the geopolitical entanglements of Israel in the Middle East. Netanyahu intertwined the narrative of Jewish history, a history of persecution and massacres, to the diplomatic and geographic conundrum of Israel in the Middle East. He did that by Nazifying the Palestinians and the conflict in the Middle East. In his 2000 book, A Durable Peace, Netanyahu wrote that the idea that the Palestinians are a separate people that deserves the right of self-determination is borrowed directly from the Nazis. In 2002, he urged the United States to invade Iraq because we now know that had democracies taken preemptive action to bring down Hitler in the 1930s, the worst horrors in history would have been avoided. In 2006, he said, it's 1938 and Iran is Germany. In 2010, he vowed that we won't forget to be prepared for the new Amalek. Amalek is a biblical figure intent on destroying the Jews, who is making an appearance on the stage of history and once again threatening to destroy the Jews. I could go on and on and on with lots of examples. Netanyahu transformed the real fear, geopolitical fear, into existential fear. Existential fear is the fear that a nation or a country will disappear. Existential fear is more diffused than fear that has an object. It is more radical, it is more total, and therefore it makes the enemy much more in need of destruction. It also helps much better to designate enemies inside the nation by connecting them to the enemies outside. And I think we can say that this is also present in other societies as well. Certainly it was present with Trump. which spoke and with white supremacism, which fear their disappearance. It is also present in the French political sphere. Zemmour, for example, used the term Francocide. And I think this fear mixes security concerns with demography. And in that sense, I think it is a new kind of spheres. Its effect, of course, is to narrow the boundaries of discourse, to make issues, political issues, into a question of survival, into a question of crushing the enemy, and therefore it also has the effect of delegitimizing the enemy. By the way, there are lots of experiments that, psychological experiments that show that indeed fear very much encourages in-groupness and accentuates the desire to punish whoever is outside the group. Such agenda renders plausible securitism. That is the view that all politics is a matter of security and that problems should be treated as military threats. And it is also, I think, at the heart of the delegitimation of the liberal left as the political movement which defends human rights and equalities. In the long run, I think this view has been undoubtedly partly responsible for the fact that the left has disappeared, entirely disappeared from the Israeli political map. So I interviewed many people, but I interviewed 2 people working in the Israeli chapter of Amnesty International, and they confirmed this. They wrote a report stating that the idea that human rights are important is widely viewed in Israel by the public and by state officials as suspicious because human rights are viewed as antithetical with security. Because security trumps all other values, government officials and ordinary citizens are willing to weaken human rights. Most interestingly, the countries in which human rights are less respected are actually less safe and more prone to conflict, which in turn justifies further fear and further securitism. So fear is the emotion which asserts the authority of the leader, turn the political rival into an enemy, and legitimizes securitist politics and turns slowly the state into a police state. Second emotion is disgust. Disgust is the emotion which deals with one of the key issues raised by populism, the relationship between majority and minority. If fear is the privileged emotion of tyrants, disgust is the privileged emotion of racists. As the anthropologist Mary Douglas observed, religions not only revolve around a sense of the sacred and the profane, but also revolve around providing symbolic order. Symbolic order by making certain things dirty and impure, and designating others as pure. Impurity provokes disgust, and disgust has also another key social property. It propagates in the social body through chains of contamination. For example, if pork is impure, then eating pork is disgusting, pork eaters are disgusting, and people who sell pork themselves are disgusting as well. In the last 2 decades, Israel has seen the burgeoning of new normative entrepreneurs whose vocation has been to change the values and content of liberal morality based on universalism and human rights. These new moral entrepreneurs, I say moral because they think they are moral, have profoundly changed the content of the public sphere by promoting disgust openly of specific groups. They are disgust entrepreneurs. Lots of politicians and new NGOs have as their function to create, engineer, and reinforce disgust towards certain groups. For example, I have lots of examples, but one of them is the Lehava organization, founded in 2009, which is an acronym for Prevention of Assimilation in the Holy Land. It opposes marriage between Jewish and non-Jewish people, especially with Muslims, and their mission is to help extricate Jewish women from harmful relationships when, of course, these Jewish women never sought their help. Bezalel Smotrich, who is the current finance minister of Israel, claimed in the past that he would not want his wife to give birth in a hospital lying near the bed of an Arab woman. He was expressing disgust and fear of contamination. Also, I studied the discourse of rabbis who teach in schools and military preparatory schools, and they spoke about Arabs, non-Jews in general, liberal Reform Jews, left-wingers, homosexual, by using the following words: venom, garbage, abomination, stench, beasts, snakes, animals, murderers, spoiled mounds, wickedness. All of these form the matrix designating Arabs and secular Jews as representing pollution, which can in turn only invoke disgust. Disgust is an emotion which justifies, enforces, and generates separation, physical and symbolic. Although it is less manifest than this, I think disgust towards immigrants and refugees is also to be found in such political characters as Donald Trump, Geert Wilders, or Eric Zemmour. Disgust, I think, is particularly dangerous in politics because it creates an ontological abyss between groups. It creates the feeling that the other group should not even be approached. Ressentiment, resentment, has always probably been present in politics. Aristotle speaks about it in his Politics. And I think the case of Israel is particularly interesting, and you will understand why. Resentment is also the most ambivalent of all emotions I discuss because it actually contains a democratic impulse. So in Israel, it played out as follows. Mizrahi Jews are those Jews who immigrated to Israel from Africa and Asia, mostly in the 1940s and 50s. It is now beyond dispute that these Jews were significantly discriminated against by what was then a socialist left-wing establishment, which was composed almost exclusively of Ashkenazi, that is, Jews from Eastern and Western Europe origins. And these Mizrahi Jews, like Arabs, were the object of deeply Orientalist views. And by the way, the Israelis were not the only ones. Of course, many non-Jewish European leaders had the same Orientalist views. But Mizrahim were associated with Arabs and were viewed as primitive and inimical to the Western project which Israel was vying to implement in the Middle East. In Israel, the left created the socialist institutions of the country, and it did that, therefore, also by discriminating against the Jews from Arab countries. It is therefore unsurprising that ressentiment, resentment, became the successful leverage used by the right-wing competitor of the socialist left, and it was used by the Likud party to unseat the continuous power of the left on politics. Menachem Begin, who headed the Likud in 1977, managed to do just this, that is, to transform the real social experience of discrimination of Mizrahim into a long-lasting resentment against Ashkenazi as an ethnic group. And this is profoundly present in the current political crisis of Israel. I don't know how much about it you know, but this is what is at stake, in fact. And so this resentment profoundly transformed Israeli politics. It created a long-lasting, powerful constituency to the right and enabled them to gain power almost continuously since 1977. Mizrahim entered politics through two doors, the religious parties and the Likud, in order to reaffirm their pride. Now, it is worth noticing that while Arabs are in many ways far more discriminated against than Mizrahi Jews by the sheer fact that they are not Jewish, they are much more excluded from the body politic, their social and political condition never translated in ressentiment, while this was indeed the case for Mizrahim, suggesting that ressentiment derives from a fundamental assumption of equality. That's why it's such an ambivalent emotion, an assumption that Israeli Arabs cannot make. It's also interesting to notice that in terms of actual policy, the right actually did not improve the condition of Mizrahim. And more than that, Netanyahu's neoliberal policies have deeply accentuated inequalities for the last 20 years and mostly benefited Ashkenazi groups. Thus, if the right still represents the Mizrahim, it is mostly for symbolic reasons. It provided them with greater symbolic status based on the incessant claim that they have been the victims of a historical discrimination whose memory is constantly carefully rehearsed, a claim which is ironically substantiated by the accentuation of inequalities which the neoliberal right has contributed to. In other words, inequalities which should have long been the responsibility of the various right-wing polities that have been in power for the last 40 years are still credited to the long-defunct left-wing rule, illustrating how resentment is built around the memory of past injuries and is able to transcend the concrete present of persistent inequalities to transport the citizen into the past. Yascha Mounk has argued in a comparative international study that populist leaders last on average much longer than populist leaders. And I think this longevity may be explained by the fact that such leaders are able to activate and keep alive and rehearse the memory of past wounds in a way which feeds into a form of wounded collective consciousness. And this is certainly something we find in Trump, in Le Pen, in UKIP, and probably others. That is the insistence that people were made invisible and irrelevant, and that the feeling of this of invisibility generates a great deal of resentment that is carefully cultivated. What is very striking in the Israeli case is the fact that the left or liberal politics, which was previously constructed as defending the rights of the underprivileged, is now viewed as the privileged, as the politics of the privileged. This is exactly what has happened in Israel and what has happened, I think, throughout the world. The left all over the world has been badly struggling to be perceived as having anything to do with the working class. It no longer is perceived as having something to do with the working class. And Israel has been paradigmatic in that because class and ethnic resentment has made it impossible for the Mizrahi working class to subscribe to the left and liberal universalist agenda. Finally, love. These three negative emotions must be transcended, if you want, by a positive emotion, which is the love in the sense that populism affirms not only the greatness of the majority and the nation, but also in the sense that it affirms its authentic purity, and that this authentic purity must be defended. This is very clear. For example, I saw many quotes coming from Orban entourage to that effect. Even though early Zionism heavily relied on religious symbols and was forcefully patriotic, it was also at the same time secular, at least in the sense that it attempted to create a common culture based on secularized religious symbols. The populists of the ideology of Netanyahu changed profoundly the content of this culture, because these secularized religious symbols became literal religious symbols, and he relied much more heavily on religious laws and principles, by the way, while being himself completely secular. And thus, he smoothly incorporated the biblical land of Israel inside the modern Israeli state. It radicalized the definition of Jewishness, which is why in 2018 a law was passed enshrining, if you want, Jewish supremacy in Israel. And it also enabled the entry of religious nationalism in the government, in the current government. Religious nationalism, here I follow the definition that Roger Friedland gives, sociologist Roger Friedland gives of this, contains four elements. First, religious nationalism views the territory, the land, as a sacred space. The land becomes a main actor in the unfolding of a divine history still in the making. Second, religious nationalists direct the bulk of their attention to the bodies of women and homosexuals. And for example, for women, they really militate to cover, separate, and regulate the erotic flesh. Third, religious nationalists accord considerable symbolic importance to foreignness, that is, on excluding foreigners. And the fourth element is that religious nationalists, much like other non-nationalist religious people, submit to God, and in submitting to God, they intermix the love of God and the love of a nation. They shroud the land and the nation in the metaphysical grandeur and fiercely guarded sacredness of God. They bring, therefore, nationalism to another level altogether. Religious nationalism is an appropriation of the land, the people, and the history through frameworks which lend them cosmic meaning and purpose. The result, actually, is ironic. It is a deeper division of society because the sacred is actually non-negotiable. So, just to conclude, the sentiments I have described here have a few things in common. They are the result of the manipulation by politicians, of the harnessing of ordinary people's fears, mistrust, anger, resentment, to the goals and strategies of political actors who are, I think, quite often rather unscrupulous. These actors, these political actors, are aided by an army of consultants, media experts, marketers, and media controlled by the right, as well as by think tanks that are financed by billionaires. This has been actually very much the case. In fact, the regime, the transformation, the coup, practically, that was attempted in Israel was really piloted from the United States by two billionaires who have been funding for the last 20 years think tanks whose goal was to operate such regime change. To be sure, such manipulations do not emerge ex nihilo. They tap into a pre-existing geography, historical traumas, and collective social experiences. They also tap into profound inequalities and increasingly dysfunctioning democratic institutions, which seem to serve a few to the detriment of the many. But a social and economic malaise needs formulation in order to be operative. It needs to be framed in narratives that are repeated and hammered in the public sphere. And this is done by the conscious work of elites, which we sometimes forget to analyze and track when we try to understand populism. And these narratives are then relayed consciously or unconsciously by print and visual media and social networks avid of attention grabbing and emotional meanings. The mixture of these emotions forms the matrix of populism because they generate antagonism between social groups inside society by pitting an imaginary people to, I think, sometimes also imaginary elites, because they create alienation from the institutions that safeguard democracy, because it wants to reaffirm the ethnic and religious supremacy of the majority, ultimately making democracy, or seeming to make democracy or democratic institution look like an obstacle to security and identity. Now, I will just end with this question. To reconstruct democracy, I think we need to discuss whether liberal politics should ignore, circumvent, or address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks. Thank you. Fantastic food for thought. And for our first session, we heard a little bit earlier. The name of our first session is Are We Witnessing a Struggle Between Democracies and Autocracies? But we can also answer the question of Professor Illouz also. So I'm asking the panelists of the first panel to join me on stage. First, directly from Strasbourg, Mr. Sven Mikser, MEP and former Defense and Foreign Minister of Estonia, please. Then Staffan Lindberg, Director of the V-Dem Institute, Karolina Zbytniewska, Chief Editor of EURACTIV in Poland, and last but certainly not least, joining us from India, Ummu Salma Bava, Professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. I hope you can hear us, Professor. Welcome. So I want to explain first the concept. We will have like shared responsibility today with you, because half of the time will be yours. You have two microphones. One is here behind the table 8, and the second one is there next to the panel of the Hambach Democracy Dialogue. And you can just, you don't need to raise hands. You can just walk when I give you a sign to the mic, and I will give you the floor. So we will have, I think, completely democratic dialogue in the next hour and 45 minutes. So thank you for being active participants in this. So are we witnessing, Mr. Mikser, a struggle between democracies and autocracies? What's the mood in Strasbourg? Because I was in Brussels recently, and it's very grim, I have to admit. All of the things that Professor Illouz said are kind of there in the air.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this important conference. I believe that yes, obviously we are witnessing on a certain level a struggle between democracy and autocracy, but I think it's also a sort of oversimplification of the complex nature of things. When I think back to my own life, I was born in 1973 in what was then the Soviet-occupied Estonia, and I remember quite vividly the end of the Cold War, the struggle against the communist rule, the so-called Singing Revolution in my own country, the liberation of the Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And I think that, back then, we were seeing a sort of a struggle between the democratic Western world, as we saw it, and the definitely non-democratic, illiberal, autocratic Soviet Empire. During those years, I think the crucial advantage that liberal democracies had over the autocracies was that the liberal democratic way of life, the system, was far more appealing not only to those people living under democracy, but also those people living in the Eastern Europe under the Soviet control. And this was I think the critical advantage that made it inevitable that democracies would come out on top. Now, meanwhile, I think what we have seen, and I think that no one has ever, no people have ever chosen autocracy or totalitarianism as the political system. I mean, it's always been enforced from the top. But people obviously can choose away from democracy. That's something entirely different. And I think that autocracies detest democracy because obviously, I mean, they cannot give people the choice because they would not be the system, and those rulers would not be elected. But they I think have realized that they need to weaken or undermine this critical advantage that democracies had over autocracies in the past. And I think we've seen them having some success in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, in making many more people in our own societies, in the democratic countries, in democratic nations, sort of doubt the advantages of liberal democracy. There are some external conditions that have made that possible, but I think that the autocracies also have knowingly tried to undermine the trust of people living under democracy in the democratic system.
I need to pass the mic to Staffan Lindberg, because what we heard from Professor Illouz and what we experience is in our countries, that undermining of democracies also comes from within. You will talk probably about the case of Poland. But in terms of this binary narrative that is being put out, would you agree that we do experiencing this fight, or however you want to articulate it? Or what's the state of play? Your institute does a lot of research. Where are we in numbers, and your interpretation of that numbers?
Yeah, unfortunately, increasingly so. And as a point of reference, this is our democracy report from the V-Dem Institute this year, Defiance in the Face of Autocratization. It's based on 31 million data collected with the help of 4,000 scholars from over 180 countries. By the data we have, in terms of the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen, we're back to 1986, the year that Gorbachev and Reagan met in Reykjavik to discuss the end of the Cold War. That should put things in perspective, I think. 72% of the world population now live in autocracies. And in this year's report, we recorded a historical record, never before seen in our time series from 1900 on to the present, a number of countries at the same time moving away from further away or away from democracy. 42 countries at the same time in the world. I think this is driven in many parts of the world by what I would say is important is that they are nationalist, reactionary, and anti-pluralist parties and leaders. Some of them are populists, okay, others are not, right? I don't think necessarily populism is the signum of what's going on in Senegal or what recently happened in Afghanistan or Mongolia, maybe Serbia, but they're anti-pluralist, and that's the key. And the ones that are in democratic societies get support, strategic, often financially and morally, from autocratic countries. So I don't think we have a choice as democracies whether there is sort of a confrontation between the remaining democracies in the world and the autocracies. The autocracies are putting up that fight, and they've been doing so for a long time, and that's what we are facing.
Thank you so much. And before I pass the floor to Professor Bava, I want to ask Karolina something not related to Poland. We'll talk about Poland later in the context of overall discussion. But this kind of distinguishing and clear line was really put out there because of the Russian aggression towards Ukraine, and Europe within itself basically starting to accelerate some processes much faster than it should be maybe before the war happened. So how do you see it from your perspective, as first of all as a journalist? Because when we discuss democracy today, what does it mean for you? I've heard today, I didn't know that the Hambach Festival was organized by journalists. It was very interesting information at that time. You know, freedom of speech was something important. So from your perspective, do you think the mechanisms out there and ideas out there in the arena of how to work on more democratic Europe, on more Europe, are right, or what do we need to do more?
I'm not muted.
No, no.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me and for your question. I think that I'm not the only one that cannot answer your question because it's extremely difficult. But still, I would like to address the general question if we face the struggle between autocracies and democracies, and starting from what you just said, from the Russian aggression on Ukraine, which was a kind of a most tangible possible illustration of the mounting of the autocracies in the world. And I was thinking about this dilemma from the title of our session a lot. And I decided that we don't face a struggle, because if there was a struggle, we would need autocracies to be somehow united. Instead, we have usually cynical and very idle individuals who actually choose autocracy because it's much more easier to be an autocrat and not be held accountable than to be democratic. Just democracy is not only, as many say, difficult for the citizens, but it's also difficult to rule. As you mentioned, for example, Afghanistan and the pluralism. It's not only about pluralism, it's about checks and balances. Checks and balances are all about blocking our doing whatever we as leaders praise and would like to do. So generally, I would say that also what Professor Illouz said. Today's autocrats are pretending to be the real democrats, but also today's new autocrats are pretending to be real liberals. And it's actually the attitude that was streamlined and was brought to the mainstream thanks to the pandemic. Populist autocrats use the pandemic to show that they are the proponents of the real liberalism, meant as freedom to do whatever we wish, to offend whoever is our non-supporter, to breach any rule, to breach and ignore any value, any norm, and any fundamental truth. So now, today, also in Poland, especially the fringe populists from the radical right in Poland are presenting themselves as the actual real proponents of real liberalism and real liberal democracy. And sovereignty is actually the victim of the same turning the reality so totally upside down. So maybe I'll end with this.
I want to pass the mic to Professor Bava from the perspective of now the most populous state in the world, from the perspective of biggest democracy in the world, from the perspective of the BRICS member, from the perspective of a democracy that maybe has some kind of, let's say, different interest in the global scene than Europe, of course, because we are in different parts of the world and our geographies and policies are different. How do you see this struggle, let's say? Is it just European or is it global? I can talk to you also as a fellow of founding members of what used to be called non-aligned movement in the Yugoslavia. Please.
So good evening to my fellow panelists and greetings from New Delhi in India. And as we speak, we have a huge cyclone making landfall in the western part of India. And I think that's a good metaphor to take for our discussion today. I'd like to commend the FES for having the Hambach Festival and discussing about democracy. It's extremely important. But let me say my three preliminary comments. First, I think we have to look at democracy as a political idea, which is a work in progress, which means it's never going to be finished. It's always going to involve bringing about change continuously, strengthening institutions, making people aware, and of course, addressing the challenges in which every state finds itself at any given point in time. And that's extremely important. Point number two is this whole, what I would call as the construction of the binary of a struggle between democracy and autocracy. I mean, as I said, there is a cyclone making landfall in country, in India, and everything else is going on. And I think we've got to ask, is this the first ever kind of contestation we are witnessing? And I think a simple answer would be no. At least in a recent history, I think post-45, if you could say that, the contestation between political ideas is a reality which a lot of people have witnessed and grown with. And I think that's an important point to remember when we create binaries, because the binary also is pushing, of course, I would say from the global south, it will increase transaction costs for states who are being forced to take sides in a war when it is presented as purely a democracy versus autocracy. Whereas the question to be asked is, was international law violated? It's not about a democracy per se question. I think that's extremely important. And a third point, which I think I would like to offer to the fellow panelists and everybody around over here, is to also ask that, the assumption that the political axis neatly falls across the economic axis is actually not true. If that was the case, you would not have any democracy in the world undertaking any business with an autocracy. A simple survey of economics, global trade, and statistics actually proves the counter narrative. That means when it comes to doing business, economics, and trade, states are not looking at the political construction and the political ideology of a particular state. One can take enough examples over here. When one can look at what Europe and the European Union itself was doing in terms of its trade with Russia, and currently your trade with China. So does that mean that it is okay to talk about just the political contestation while you do not choose to engage with the economic dimension of it, which means it is okay to have business dealings and trade with autocracies and such kind of countries which do not by any definition come close to the political values which are endorsed by another set of countries? I think the answer is far from it. Today, one is hearing in the backdrop of the war, in the backdrop of the pandemic, that there should be a decoupling with China that should be taking place. And second, how to de-risk, reduce the risk. But even, if one were to put our minds to it, to turn the economies around, to decouple and de-risk, it's not going to happen overnight. Everybody is heavily invested into this complex interdependence, economic interdependence, and therefore creating just a political argument to say that there is a political binary, but we will not seek to examine the economic aspect of it, I think is oversimplifying the argument and creating political choices which may not be tenable in the long run.
It's fantastic input that you put economy into it, because there was always this thing that, capitalism doesn't need democracy debate. But we can also talk about, multilateralism in various levels, or before we start giving some ideas and solutions and discussing it with audience, understanding basically the concepts that we used to know that maybe are not the same. So liberal, illiberal democracy, and is liberal democracy autocracy in that regard? Or what was Professor basically saying in terms of, implementing some other things into politics of today. So how do you see, Staffan, at all, like the terms that we are having still on the table? Are they valid anymore?
I think the terms are valid. Let me note, you classified India as clearly as a democracy. We don't. and all the institutes around the world that are measuring democracy have downgraded India in the recent years severely, whether we look at categories or whether we look at indices and different measures. But the term illiberal democracy that Orban likes to throw around, and somebody has sort of picked up, is what we can call with the fancy term oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. Democracy cannot be illiberal. The illiberalism that they refer to is cultural sort of or social things that have with family or LGBTI rights and so on. But democracy is predicated on pluralism, the acceptance of, whether you're a populist or not, the acceptance of that you may have a different view than I have, and we discuss it, and we resolve that conflict peacefully. When you start to delegitimize your political opponents because of their views, you reject their right to have those views, then you're starting to be anti-pluralist. And then you reject democracy as a fundament. So illiberal, and that's the sort of basic meaning of liberalism, the basic value fundament of liberalism is pluralism. Whether it's started in theology and then it's traveled over other disciplines, but the foundation has always been pluralism. So illiberal democracy is not a term we should accept. It's a political device for Orban and other wannabe dictators to do away with democracy in the name of something they call democracy.
But in that regard, and the framing that we're experiencing for the last couple of years, Mr. Mikser, I want to refer also to something that Eva Illouz said, that from the populist far right, they want to put all politics as a matter of security, and that's part of the delegitimation of political left. Because of the war in Ukraine, you know, security is our top priority as Europe as such. So what are we all facing if we, for example, when was the migration plan adopted the other day? So what are we all being exposed to as democracy with this highly securitized environment that we're living in?
Well, I think that Professor Illouz is right in saying that Israeli politics is very particular, and it's probably far more securitized than the discourse in Israeli politics than in most. In some parts of Eastern Europe, I think politics has been pretty sort of securitized as well, but not to the degree I think that it is in Israel. But the Russian aggression against Ukraine is important in a way because we see it in very existential terms, not necessarily because we see it as a sort of external military threat to our own security. We do in Estonia perhaps more than people in Germany, but it's not only about that. We see it as existential from the point of view of the rules-based international order as we know it today. I mean, there is UN Security, United Nations and UN Security Council. That is the main normative body of international law and international norms. And now
where Russia is sitting.
Yes, and now we see one of the permanent veto-powered members of that organization basically going against all of the basic principles of that very body. And we as democracies have been pretty much the main architects of the current rules-based international order, but also the main beneficiaries. And I think this is, we are sometimes wondering why we see many countries in the world being sort of lukewarm about sort of siding with us in this very existential conflict as we see it. And I think it's not because they are necessarily sort of wanting to side with autocracies against democracies, but it's more because they don't see themselves as having a similar stake in the preservation of this rules-based international order as we do. So I think this is crucial. I mean, we have the most populous country in the world that is nowhere near the permanent seat of the UN Security Council, for example. I mean, they probably don't quite see that they have a similar stake to, I don't know, Russia. Russia is challenging that order from a different angle, but as for example the US or UK or France.
What Staffan Lindberg said, and also Professor Bava, we've seen that, you know, democracies and autocracies lived side by side until now, but you pointed out a crucial thing, and that is how to build the architecture that we know now, or adopted architecture post-Second World War, was basically there because we knew who won and who lost in the war. That was a very important point. So I want to go to New Delhi and asked basically in this regard what Mr. Mikser was saying. You know, do you think as a country which is not in UN Security Council, which wanted basically to be more involved in what we knew as this highest multilateral body, what is the debate within India, how things should change after, let's put it as a clear thing now, after Putin loses? Or some other scenarios that you are looking at?
So I think, let me point out two issues over here. One, I think it's the issue of what we are currently witnessing, the war in Ukraine, and the issue of the rules-based order. I think it's important to ask and to clearly identify that, you know, when Europe presents an argument that it is an existential threat and the rest of the world should fall in line, there are a lot of existential threats around the world. A rules-based order would have to apply for everybody. It cannot be a selective prescription of rules for one and order for the other. This is the kind of argument which one has seen from the West, and I think that is not something which, every country is just going to jump and do. The second thing I would like to point out, if we are talking about the rules-based order and the existential threat, then in 2014, as the annexation of Crimea took place, one would have expected a far more greater response, collectively and individually, from the Europeans. I don't think we saw any evidence of that apart from economic sanctions. Business continued as usual with Russia. I think it's important to be self-reflective over here to ask that today when, after 2014, 6 years later, as the invasion of Ukraine took place, it did not become more existential than it was in 2014. But I mean, there was a collective silence if the rest of the world is what you're asking at. Staffan was pointing about statistics and saying that, India is not a democracy. You may not consider us a democracy. That would be an opinion you're very free to hold. And I'm not here talking on behalf of the government or representing, but as an academic, I think, it's important to reflect and ask that just presenting statistics does not delegitimize the democracy and, as I said, a work in action. I think that reflective lens has to be held by every country around the world. By that, many countries in Europe today are also seeing a democratic deficit and a democratic withdrawal. The point is, if you start narrowing an argument like this, you're only going to talk about, a group which either you belong to or you don't belong to. The question to ask is, are we willing to look at how the politics of identity will construct issues and present choices to people? These are driven from within, and these are also driven from outside. And second, the issue of illiberalism. I don't agree with the notion of illiberal democracy. I think there are elements of illiberalism present overall. And finally, to conclude, Ivana, on the point of the reform of the UN Security Council, I think the 5 permanent Security Council members will have to be in unison to bring about reform, and India is working along with other 3 countries. I don't think when the UN Security Council, was created, the litmus test was how much of a democracy you were at that point in time. So I think it's a rather strange argument to be forwarded that just because your democratic indicators are not up to our standards, we don't think that you're ready to take on task of the world.
So, Karolina, are we narrowing the debate, what Professor just said, that we're narrowing the debate in terms of, defining what democracy is, and basically, can we talk at all about uniformity of democracies concerning the point in history we're living in now?
Certainly, there are differences in democracies, and it's important to also look at who has the monopoly of defining democracy and liberal democracy. If there is just one pattern that everyone should adopt, I don't know. Rather, I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't agree with that, because there are local characteristics that make ourselves on the individual, local and country level, different creatures, different natures. That's why we will have problems with achieving the rules-based world order, apart from having that on this aspiration level and on some kind of ideals level, something that we want to reach someday. It's really difficult to achieve that. I can say that as a citizen of Poland, when we have problem with a rules-based order in terms of the European Union itself. And now, what to do with rogue countries like, for example, Poland or Hungary, but also others, when we misbehave in terms of rule of law and the European Union's democratic and liberal standards. We have this mechanism of conditionality on rule of law in terms of European Union funds. But up to now, it hasn't stopped the slide of Polish liberal democratic norms. No, to the opposite. Actually, it's being used, and it has become a really handy weapon of our government to show that the European Union is illegally infringing on our sovereignty. So should we impose this conditionality, or how to make that really work, because it doesn't. And now there are also funds flowing from the United States to Poland to support our defense and security. It is great, but there are some voices that the United States should also have them conditional on rule of law and democratic standards. But isn't that not against the Polish rule, the Polish security, the security of Polish citizens? Isn't that the thing only to punish our government at the cost of our citizens' security? Now, I'm not actually saying my own arguments. These are arguments of my friends, intellectuals from the left side, who actually are here on the same side with the Polish government that is, as I already mentioned, evaluating any conditionality as equal to illegal infringing on our internal affairs and the Polish sovereignty, which is sacrosanct.
And there is one thing that is in common, doesn't matter, you know, who is putting out infringement methods, who is not, and that is corruption, which is the same in democracies and autocracies. But I want to just open the floor and see, is there any people who are brave enough to go and walk to the microphone? If I'm looking at you, just go, it's free. I want to pass the conversation to what can we do in that regard, because I've written down, I've been following closely during the pandemic this so-called deliberative experiment called Conference on the Future of Europe. Everyone thought, not going to work, nothing is going on. But it really brought up some ideas out there from the citizens of Europe. But with this kind of, is this existential crisis, what Eva was explaining now with the war it is, Europe is facing. So what models and ideas are there to change or adapt our democracies for the future, build up the lost trust in process? You've mentioned that people tend to say they're for democracies. There are surveys, very much surveys that, for example, European youth likes Mr. Putin very much. They would prefer to have some strong leader more than democratic process. So we have inequalities within Europe, very strong apathy, changes in digital space which influence people and their decisions. So this aspect of digital democracy for Estonia is very, known for. So what are the models from which we can build more trust within our society that is scared and that is going to vote for the first time after 2 big crises next year in June?
Well, I think that if you go to any people anywhere in the world and ask whether they would like to have a welfare state with freedom of speech or the opposite, I mean, it's a pretty easy choice. I don't think that you would find people anywhere in the world who would say that, well, we would like the alternative.
Please, you have a challenge.
Just talk to the Republicans in the U.S. They don't want a welfare state. They want freedom of speech, their freedom of speech, but the way GOP has...
welfare state, perhaps not, but I mean, the liberal democracy, or and you can obviously, I mean...
if you ask a 16-year-old in Austria, which has a right to vote, does he know what liberal democracy is? What answer would you get?
No, not necessarily. I don't think they know what liberal democracy is. But basically, if you describe the attributes, I think that they will still have a majority in favor of those attributes of liberal democracy. But also the crucial thing is that for decades, liberal democracies have demonstrated that it is the most competitive model. It's the best model also to provide economic success, to produce economic success. And if you see, I mean, this economic success being replaced by economic stagnation, then obviously that hurts the competitive edge of democracy as a model. But there are other factors sort of undermining the success of liberal democracy. And I think that what made democracy possible in the first place were essentially 2 things: mass literacy and mass media. So people were able to access
these 2 things that you mentioned are now ruining democracy.
And these are, I mean, and now you see in the shared information space being virtually disappearing. I mean, people are being pushed into very personalized, individualized, algorithm-controlled information bubbles, and that, by definition, sort of makes this center ground vacant or empty. And people are being pushed to the extremes, and this sort of shared information space is disappearing very fast. And it doesn't really make much sense for most politicians to try to appeal to the center ground because it's being deserted.
Yeah, but this is, please, I will give you the floor, but this is defensive position. We know what's the problem, it's scary, it's huge, but what can we do?
Oh, I can't tell you what to do.
Okay.
I can tell you what the research says. On the first point, and we just published a report on the case for democracy that was part of this beginning of this Biden summit here in the spring. It's very clear that you're right. It's very clear historically and contemporary that democracies on average are better than the autocracies on generating economic growth. And they're also better at avoiding the disastrous economic outcomes. But democracies are not, historically and especially not contemporary, better at reducing inequality. And that's one of the long-term trends we've had since the early 1980s, with increasing levels of inequality. Even in Sweden, my own country, that's especially here in Germany, known for this big welfare state and so good society, we have historical levels of relative inequality.
But which system is the best at it?
Sir?
Which system is
No,
the best?
autocracies are not, it just evens out, but that's narrative about democracy being better. It should, in some theory, should be better at addressing inequality. If you empower poor people, they should elect politicians that do something about their socioeconomic poverty, right? But that's prevented, especially in contemporary democratic systems. So that's a flaw that we can discuss, or you can discuss what to do about. I'm a scholar, I'm not a politician. So that's, those are the facts that research show. The media sector and the social media and the spread of disinformation is a whole other, that would take another 2 minutes if I talk about it, but.
We'll come to that because no one is, I cannot believe that you are all so shy or what. Please, just walk and introduce yourself and ask the first question because we have an hour more, so we need to.
Let's start it because it's always the first question is the most
Please.
difficult one, then there will be plenty of. I'm a politician, I'm a member of the European Parliament, and I'm from Hungary. Opposition, of course. And it was very interesting and really very useful and very scary to listen to you, especially because what you told about Israel, what we know about Poland, the same happens in Hungary, it happened in Russia, it happened in Turkey, and so on and so on. And it's very important for us to understand the populists because, unfortunately, they are our competitors when we talk about the political arena. And we talk a lot about the supply side. So what do they give to the people? What do they promise? For me as a politician, and that maybe is going to be an answer for your question, it's equally important the demand side of populism. Why do people in the last 30 years, more and more turn themselves into populists? And I don't have the right answer yet, because if I would have this answer, then Orbán would be not a prime minister of Hungary anymore. I hope to get it within a few years and to defeat him. But let's just say a few issues. We talk about inequality and about economic growth. That's definitely one of the reasons. It's a very rational reason, and we Social Democrats are rational people. But it's definitely true that in the last 25 years, inequalities growth. And in 2008 and 2009, the world, what we imagined, the capitalism, the free market, the competition, did not deliver. I mean, suddenly it collapsed and made people insecure. And the growing inequalities, they make people suffer and be angry. So definitely it's about economy. But it's definitely not only about economy, because if it would be like that, then illiberals would stay in power maximum for 4 years, because none of them deliver, none of them. Every single country which is under illiberal or autocrat, the people are living worse than they were before, living in democracy. So it's not only economy. Then what can it be? You mentioned the social media and the whole problem of information technology. How do people decide objectively when they do not have the information because they are in their own bubbles? So definitely this is one of the issues as well. And there is a third one we don't talk about a lot. In the last 20 years, 25 years, the world has changed so quickly that has never been experienced in the past 1,000 years of human history and mankind. I mean, majority you are young people, and I'm definitely sure when a new, iOS is coming out and you have to make your telephone with a new program, then you are happy and you are experiencing how it works. Even for me, being not so young anymore, in 50, I mean, it takes me at least a few weeks until I get used to the new telephone. And can you imagine that people in the last thousands of years, when they reached the age of, let's say, 35, 40, they had the knowledge, which gave them security that I can rule my own small world. I have the knowledge. I don't have to learn anymore. I mean, I have the experience. And now we have to learn until the end of our life. And we Social Democrats, let's say, a few years ago, we said that lifelong learning, what a wonderful thing. I like it. I love it. And I think in the room, everyone loves it. I think millions, if not billions of people are terrified from the fact that they have to learn all day life long and to experience new issues and get used to new issues. And I'm sure that I'm not at the end of the list, and it's not a prioritized, but I would be very interested if you could a little bit add to any part of the demand side. Why are people so open to this kind of lies and this kind of ruling? What is the demand side of populism? That would be very interesting for me. Thank you.
Fantastic comment and a great question. Thank you very much. Who wants to pick up with the question?
I can say a few things on the demand side. There's lots of work being done right now, research. There is an increasing body of research using micro-level data, survey experiments, all that sort of stuff, that are in different ways indicating that this rise in inequality is a fertile ground for, whether you call them populist, but I don't think that's the important part, but the nationalist and reactionary narratives about a great future that was in the past and now we're going to recreate it, often tied to whatever religious conservative group is there. Or Orban became a Christian suddenly. I mean, God. Hindu nationalist, Muslim nationalist in Erdogan's Turkey, Trump with the Pentecostal, same with Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so on. So there is an increasing body of evidence there saying that's a fertile ground. And that reminds about the 1930s, right? Unfortunately. We also know that some of the demand can be engineered. So the data is very clear with increasing levels of polarization in society, and then autocratization, dismantling of democracy. And that polarization is often driven from the top, but with the help of all this under-vegetation using social media and other medias, right? And when you can reach polarization to high levels, and the keynote speaker spoke about these emotional reactions, so you can make people fear about the future and fear their political opponents. Then research shows they are, and in different contexts now, experiments show when you evoke that fear, then we as human beings are much more likely then to be okay with do away with some civil liberties and political rights and all that to save us, right? We're still these sort of herd animals from 4 million years ago until today. And that fear, existential fear, when you can create that with toxic polarization, then you have laid the ground for a demand of do away with some of the democratic rights. That's part of what the research says about the demand side.
Karolina and then Mr. Mikser, please.
So she was already mentioned today. So Professor Hochschild, she wrote a book entitled "Strangers in Their Own Land," and on the demand side, she diagnosed that angry white men are feeling left out by the left and progressive policies, and there now is a lot of similar of research in Poland on angry young men that are polling as ones voting for fringe right-wing party, Konfederacja, that is even more right than the ruling party, Law and Justice. And their general wish is to dry the swamp of the politics, to quote Donald Trump. They don't want the politicians that are there now. They just want change, and they count for people that will help them be independent economically. For them, there are these two priorities: change and anti-establishment individualism of economy, so that they are not checked by the state, by taxes, by regulations. They lost any trust in the state. That's why. That's why. And
you just continue. We need a bottle opener.
Okay.
Just short intermezzo. I'm sorry.
Yes. But more generally, Staffan mentioned that the pluralism as being vital characteristics of liberal democracy, and I said that it's a little bit more generally, it's checks and balances, because pluralism means opposition. Among other things. That's why generally our populists, our autocrats are against any checks and balances and against opposition. And that's why in the countries where it is still possible, like Poland, like still Hungary and still Israel, our oppositions need to stand up for their rights and to write really better programs that they do to allow democracy to come back to surface and to win. Because, for example, now we have seen what happened in Turkey, and we have seen what happened in Hungary. And there are no lessons learned as far as I observe the Polish political climate at the moment. Our opposition, Donald Tusk, very charismatic. I really like him, and many people
but I have to, it's a very interesting situation in Poland because you have EPP conservatives, they're like progressive opposition. That's also an interesting model.
The problem is that their ultimate major political tenet is being against law and justice. And to win, because they are the good guys, so they should win against the bad guys. The end of their political agenda. Maybe there is some stuff about abortion, but I'm really looking forward, liberalizing of the abortion. I'm really looking forward to see their solutions. So peace destroyed our judiciary. How they want to cure it? What exactly do they want to do with our constitutional tribunal, with our courts, with our judges? What do they want to do? We don't hear any answers nor anything about this. What about the public media that is utterly politicized? What they are planning to do? We don't hear any answers. There was one proposal by one of the co-leaders of the United Opposition, Rafał Trzaskowski, to close the public media. Well, that's only funny. That's not constructive at all. So our oppositions should really start thinking constructively what to do apart from being the good guys and because of that being chosen.
I think that you see economic inequality creates resentment, and economic insecurity obviously creates fear. But also I think Clara is onto something very important in that the social change is accelerating, and obviously this sort of fast pace of change creates a sense of insecurity and fear as well. And I think that also when you look at how the resentment of the Israeli Mizrahi community brought Likud to power in '77 and more or less has held Likud in power for most of the time since, even though they haven't delivered to that community. I mean, we have seen something similar more broadly with the traditional socialist voters. I mean, who have been these blue-collar workers, especially, who have been moving from the social democrats to the sort of right-wing conservative populists, because they actually have offered something else. And the conservatives traditionally have been defending what I would what they call tradition or traditional way of life, what I call sort of morally unjustifiable privilege. And it has been traditionally the privilege of the few, of the elite, of the minority. But now increasingly it's the sort of imaginary privilege of the deprived majority, and that has been a key factor, I think, in how they have been managing to grab part of whom we have seen as our traditional voters, and because it's largely those working class voters who have brought many of those populists to power.
Thank you. We have 3 people waiting, which is, I applaud to this, but I would need to prioritize the person who has a question for Professor Bava. Is there any one of 3 of you who has one?
Perhaps.
Okay, the lady there. So please, because she was there, just put this the first question. Please, guys, I'm sorry, because we need to think about the parity. She's far away, but she's present with a question.
Thank you very much, and a quick thank you for a fabulous keynote and a thought-provoking panel. I'm Veera Heinonen. I'm from Finland's innovation fund, CET. And one thing that has been touched upon but hasn't really been addressed is the question of reforming and updating our democratic infrastructure. And it is one of those, I think, those tensions that we have. We are in a postmodern world, but we conduct our business with an industrial era system that we are very hesitant to update. And I would particularly challenge the representative system that is hesitant in devolving power to more direct methods of democracy. And we know from research that modern citizens are very individualistic and are not attached to these big ideologies anymore as such. So I firmly believe that if we would address this democratic deficit with more participative methods, I think that could be one of the keys that you were asking, how to protect our democracy. Just a quick point about the fractured, fragmented, splintered information environment. I think we lack imagination. We take big tech and social media as something that is a given and is the public space and sphere where we conduct our discussions. We need to design technology for conducting the business of democracy and the new information environment. We have already non-profit organizations rolling out new methods, and I think the European Union institutions could be key in leading this investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll wait. Second question, please. You can go to your place. Thank you. We'll answer.
My name is Alexandra Kuzmenko, a FES scholarship holder. So the question I would like to ask has already been touched from one point, from the point of support of other countries which have non-democratic tendencies. However, I would like to ask my question. It's a bit naive, however, it's burning for me. So how can we fight against these autocracies when in some countries, the citizens, for example, in Turkey, in Russia, so they support this kind of rule because it is based on the results of the elections, and they seem to be happy and content with the situation. That's why I would like to hear your opinion. What can we do to fight it?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Third question.
Thank you, Finn Heinrich from Open Society Foundations, a foundation which is trying to defend and expand democracy. So this debate is very close to our heart, obviously, so thank you. And I wanted to connect what you, Madam Moderator, asked about what to do, right? As a foundation, we are keen to what to do, but also connected to the original question about are we in a battle of different systems? And maybe we are or not, but if you look at, in my view, one of the reasons why Putin is waging the war with Ukraine is that the Ukrainian people are longing and are practicing an ideal of democracy and moving towards that, which is of danger to his rule. And I think there's a deeper truth for us in that as well. So democracy as an ideal still holds a lot of power in our societies, but also is dangerous for the autocrats. And I feel my question is, if that is really true and we have a deficit in our democracies, shouldn't one of the ways we are trying to deal with that is to expand and, as the colleague from Finland said, practice democracy much more. Conference on the future of Europe was mentioned. But shouldn't we think beyond that? What about public ownership, democratic ownership in the economy? What about practicing democracy in our workplaces, in schools? So isn't the expansion and the practice of democracy a key tool towards fighting the autocrats?
I have to add to that before I give Katarina the question. I was at Europe's, what's the name of the council, which collects syndicates, business and NGOs, European, yes. And they had a meeting of high school pupils from all around Europe, and the common conclusion of all of them is give us civic education, unanimously. Democratic, civic, call it as you like, please.
Yeah, I think my question really connects to that one, and I also said it in my opening already. FES is a democracy supporter. Say we have more than 100 offices around the world, and I think just like Open Society or perhaps also people from other institutions here in this room are wondering what can we do about, Staffan, the development that you have described, that there are more and more autocracies now. And what can we do to also perhaps encourage more democracies also abroad? And I'm just wondering, with this new narrative and also these summits on democracy and so on, and trying to continuously perpetuate this narrative of struggle between autocracy and democracy, you have to decide, and this black and white is a little bit like in Poland, Karolina, like you described. You have to decide if it's only the bad guys or the good guys. Is that helping? And also, Staffan, from your experience, is that something that encourages people more because to really stand behind the values of democracy? And would that be successful? Or also perhaps from the perspective of India or other Asian countries, perhaps, I don't know if you also have knowledge on this, Professor Bava, is that something that is that people are receptive to in other countries if they are classified, for example, as an electoral autocracy? Would they want to become a democracy? Is that a narrative that is helping us as democracy supporters or not?
Thank you so much. We'll go from the beginning again, but this question also is a question of all of them. So what can we do? What kind of democratic infrastructure that we build? What kind of new participative methods can we build? We know that the conclusion of the Conference of the Future of Europe is in a way to give more direct democracy to European citizens. So Mr. Mikser, maybe tell us, because you're sitting in the European Parliament, what's been going on within the debate and what can we do on our local levels and national levels, because I think that, people often don't see what's going on in Brussels, and that is also one part of disenfranchisement with democracy.
Well, I think that obviously this devolution of democracy is possible, is necessary, and is happening. I mean, with different speed and success in different places and on different levels. But well, I come from a country where you can vote online, and a great way of actually giving people easier access to practicing democracy. But I think that one of the big issues that we have to acknowledge is that one of the main functions of us politicians is to make to be the non-specialist arbiters who will decide how to distribute insufficient resources between fields of life. It was decades ago when Aldous Huxley, I believe, wrote that, for example, the medical science has made such advances recently that there is not a single healthy person in the world anymore. I mean, the more and more the scientific and advances basically make it possible theoretically to solve real people's real issues, but the resources that we collectively command are simply insufficient to do that. That's a very big sort of bioethical dilemma, but also a political dilemma. And I think that this is going to remain one of the principal functions of the so-called political class in the representative democracy. And this issue will not be, unfortunately, resolved by the devolution of democracy to local communities or lower levels.
Thank you so much. I will pose the second question to Karolina, because it kind of asks the same question as for Poland and for Hungary. So why do people support that rule? How can we fight against autocracies and illiberal tendencies, even though Staffan doesn't like the word illiberal? But how can we, when citizens vote for them?
Well, citizens vote for them because, as I said, they are disappointed with the system. As Professor Illouz was mentioning, this politics of emotions, it's valid both on the supply side, but also on the demand side. So in the poorer people, less educated from the rural areas, for example, in Poland, they don't care about the climate. They care about climate at their homes. What will the husband do when he comes back drunk home from the bus stop? Often this politics of emotions is of these emotions that were mentioned by Professor Illouz is the one that is catering to the demand in some circles. On the other hand, there are big cities where the demands are totally different. They're progressive. But at the same time, there are also people who are from the cities, non-progressives. These are the ones that I mentioned, that are the voters of the ultra-right, who are often well-educated and better standing, having good work, and they just are disappointed by the state, disappointed by the whole political class, whatever, right wing or left wing or the center. They just want novelty and someone that will not infringe on their home and work sovereignty. So it's this sovereignism thing. But how should we treat these autocracies that still hold elections and people still support them? This is a really difficult question, because we were mentioning China today, and U.S. Secretary Blinken is visiting China, and before there was this message about the must of talking about difficult issues in between the countries, and to that China replied that we don't want U.S. to meddle in our internal affairs. Internal affairs meaning human rights abuses versus, for example, Uyghurs. But since 1948, human rights abuses are not an internal issue. Also about the spy balloon, but spying on another country is not an internal affair. But at the same time, we have global problems, like, for example, AI, that, as we know, is now an existential, potentially, problem for the humanity. And in order to regulate the AI and infuse it with ethical standards, we cannot do that alone. Even the US cannot do it alone with NATO, for example. We need to have a global pact on that. We need to talk with China. We need to talk to autocrats to stand on these global issues together. So that's a very difficult problem, and I have no answer for that.
Yes, and weaponization of AI.
Yeah.
When we can put this, you put a fantastic thing out there. I'll ask all the audience to leave it in last half an hour, and that is that we lack imagination. I will really like the whole room to start, imagining like we have everything on our disposal. So to be creative and think of it, because I completely agree with you. So Staffan, I would like to put the question from the colleague from the Open Society. Is, autocracy still fearing the democracy? Because there's been a discussion, people are waiting that something will happen inside of Russia, as some kind of revolt. So is that still the case for Putin, or in general, or for China, for anyone? And can we build what was mentioned, some kind of public ownerships and other kind of practices for them.
Yeah. Well, with the case of Russia, it's very clear that Putin feared that democracy was sort of developing, if you put it that way, in Ukraine. And so for some autocrats, that's a threat. For others, it's not. Some simply don't care, and to varying degrees. I think, and following up also on what was just said in relation to also the first question maybe, I think it's important in this, whether it's a battle or not, I'll come back to that. But I think it's very important, if I may offer some kind of advice that I think I could say, it's very important for politicians, whether it's European Parliament or whether it's from national governments or European institutions, to be honest and open about trade-offs. When you have to deal with, for whatever, security reasons, for economic reasons, for something, and you have to disregard some human rights abuses or the trampling on democratic rights in this or that country because we have other priorities that we need to set first right now, then be open about that. The worst things democracies can do today is to claim that, and I think my colleague from India was also speaking to that earlier, is to make big claims about that we are always behind human rights everywhere in the world over, and then you're de facto not, right? Well, then say, well, right now we can prioritize that here in this conflict. That's very important to preserve the legitimacy of the norms, the democratic and human rights norms we stand for, to preserve the legitimacy and our, as countries, our trustworthiness, that when hard choices are made, well, then say those are hard choices and we have to make them, and this is the determination we do. I think that also ties to this battle. I was a little bit I answered yes to your question in the beginning, say, yeah, there is a battle. And in some ways there are, I mean, you can't discuss with Putin, right? That's obvious right now. And he has been working for 20 years, just like China has been working for 35 years or more to sort of infiltrate and support anti-democratic groups in democratic societies, because that has a purpose. And there are Iran, and there are the Saudis, and many players here. So in a way, and because a lot of democracies have even become much worse democracies or become electoral autocracies or even worse, and the trend is so strongly in the negative direction, and I think the war was sort of a wake-up call for much of Europe in the sense that, we may have to defend our democratic rights and human rights with arms in hand, just like the Ukrainians do. It was a sit-up call, a wake-up call. So in that sense, in the sense that democracy is under attack across the world, globally, from several forces, Putin is one of them, right? And has been for about 20 years now, we haven't really noticed until lately. And in that sense, there is.
But we have terrorist attacks.
But at the same time,
different.
Yes, and at the same time, I mean, of course, there are many more freedoms in India than in North Korea, right? And there are shades of gray, and there are different areas. In some countries, it's more harassment of journalists. In others, it's more attacks on political parties, and there's lots of variation. And we have to acknowledge and try to work with that, right? There is a lot of nuance, a lot of difference, also in the ways, and in the ways countries are not democratic or becoming less democratic. So it's important to when looking at it more closely at different countries, to acknowledge that, I think. So to Johanna, the last question. It's not black and white, of course. In the big scheme of things, maybe it looks more black and white, but as soon as you go down, of course, it's much more complicated.
Can I pass it to Professor Bava also on this black and white? You've already basically pictured the side from you, but is still what we describe as electoral autocracy, you name it, is still the appeal of what this liberal or the real, or how do we define it, democracy is out there in the world, and what is at stake if we leave things black and white?
Thank you, Vanna. I think, unfortunately, the debate is a very black and white. It is not about nuancing. It doesn't look at what kind of internal challenges societies face and what politics does. And I thank Staffan for the last point you said on trade-off, because politics really is about trade-offs. And the point to ask is, while labels may be an easy way of bypassing, and as academics we may do that, we may label things, but does it truly capture the essence of what is happening within a polity and within a society? I think that's very important to identify. For me, based here in India, I'm aware of the kind of changes which are happening. I'm also equally proud of the strong constitution we have and the institutions we have. I always believe that, that, like I said, this is a work in progress. It's not one till the next election takes place. At the same time, it's not about sitting back. And in the last year, as we saw what the pandemic did, there was such a great absorption of technology in India, for example, just to put it, and how that technology, which can be fear-producing, was also something which helped to integrate a lot of people, democratize the space by terms of access. It's not the best. I mean, if you obviously don't have electricity, you will not be able to access anything. One is aware of that. But I think it's important to go back to the first question, Ivana, when you were asking about it, is what can be done? I think there's an apathy towards what politics produces. At the end of the day, everybody's consuming a lot of things, whether it's a tech good, whether it's economics. But the point to ask is, how much are we doing to engage our people, our youth, to make them recognize how much their participation is valuable for the kind of political change that they want to see happen? That's point one. Point two is, what kind of civic engagement is taking place? If you're talking about democracy within, at the multilateral and the global level, you don't see so much of democracy. There is no global demos. In fact, institutions of the post-45 period are extremely embedded in a democratic way, which does not reflect the balance of power which is taking shape at the economic level. So, one could get into different kind of arguments over there, but I think it's important not to get caught in labeling. It's important to ask, if we talk about what I would call as the politics of trade-off, then that politics of trade-off cannot apply only to a select few countries. It cannot be that their normative levels are going to be the one which will dictate and frame the political decisions of the other countries. Sweden and Finland, in view of what has been happening in Europe, today decided to join, NATO membership. For India, in our part of the world, there is no such organization and nothing will ever come about. Nobody is going to come and defend India if there should be an attack on Indian territory. I think these are the kind of realities which have to be placed on the table when you discuss about the kind of choices states have. Why is it we sometimes see the politics of apathy set in? And more importantly, how is it that you talked about civic education? One of the people talked about it. The need to re-engage and revisit what does it mean to be a democracy and how does everybody contribute to it in an everyday manner.
Thank you so much, please.
Very much excellent discussion. I learned a lot already. My name is Julia Leininger. I work for the former German Development Institute. We were renamed and we are the Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS now. And I have 2 points. My first point is what did I learn? I learned that anti-pluralism and dismantling accountability and checks and balances erodes democracy, and that populist governments or leaders are very effective and efficient in helping to do that, in eroding that, because they address, they use and abuse emotions. And I think we talked a lot about the emotions, but I still struggle with this, because this really changes, if we talk about defending democracy, this changes the ways how we have to defend democracy. Because I mean, emotions, I want to believe something, and I want to believe a truth, and it's not only about being in your own echo chamber or community, it's also about not believing in facts, right? It's something we face in our policy advice actually often these days. So my question is, because I mean, we also see that hate is a big thing. We didn't talk about hate. So people who experience that hate, who defend democracy, and are confronted with these emotions, don't have any means. I mean, if I talk to local politicians here in Germany, to politicians in our parliament, there's no answer to that. And so my first question is maybe to the Israeli and Indian experience. Are there strategies that your politicians, your local politicians, civil society organizations, democracy defenders use to counter those emotions? And then civic education. I mean, I hear that as a silver bullet, actually, in how to address this. And I do agree. I mean, there is evidence that, for instance, in the US context, bringing together opponents, and they talk frequently over a period of half a year, that really helps to mitigate hate, and they start to understand each other, so that helps, or seems to help at least. I don't know how, or we don't know yet how long that lasts. But what I think is a really, really missing link is the question, who needs the civic education? And when we talk about civic education, we think about people from, I mean, I work a lot in the African context, that's like 18 to 35 and above. But with 18, the values a person carries and that drives what you think and what you do on the long run are built. That's it. With 18, more or less, sometimes earlier, it's really hard to change the fundamental values of people. So the kids of those emotion-driven autocracy or autocrat supporters today are the ones who get those values, right? So, and it's very too simple, and one has to think it through, of course. And but I do think we need to think more about civic education and curricula for
kindergarten from my side.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because Putin played on Z kids, building up the narrative on purpose.
Yes,
he built Z kids. Thank you. So who
I have a second point, and that's the future thing. And no, I have another thing which I think is difficult in this type of conversation, and we have this conversation since 2-3 years now, is we analyze the deficit, which does not enable us to imagine a positive future, because we always start with the deficit and how can we go about that. And I do think we need to start to dream a bit and think about the positive future. And the last thing, how to do this is probably, and maybe from a research perspective, there was one good thing about the Cold War. Because in the Cold War, we couldn't think about a political regime, democracy or autocracy, without thinking about the economic system. And that's a big difference, because it was different economic systems. Today, autocracy and democracy lay in the very same bed. And they compete to be in that cozy bed, and they profit from it at the same time. And I do think we have to connect this conversation about the future to this economic idea in the economic system and capitalism as well. Thank you. And sorry for taking so
No, thank you very much. It's good to have inspired people. It's fantastic. So thank you. I just want to make a short point, if I may, as a moderator. I built my dream out of fear, and that fear is still of the nuclear threat. I was a kid in Chernobyl times, and I dreamt that I will give birth to a child with two heads. So talking about fear does not only motivates populist and right-wing, fear motivates me at this current moment, and fear of what is building up from the other side. So maybe we can also dream from perspective of fear. Please take this long comment as an introduction to your closing remarks. So take your time, please. We'll start from Staffan.
Okay, I've made many points. I've had lots of time, so I will try to be minimalistic here. And basically pick up on, I think it was Vera's from Finland's point, discussing about
no, we have 3 more questions.
Yes, how
we have 3 more people there in the line. I didn't see you.
Oh.
Okay, then answer this, and we'll go pick up the 3 questions.
But I wanted to make
we
this
run out
my
of time.
last.
Be short, no comments, just questions now. Thank you, because we let you be very philosophical. So you took our time, please.
Okay, I want this to be the last point that you remember when you go home, but just try and remember it anyway. Okay. So Vera and others. About reforming democratic institutions to work in what you call a postmodern society. I don't like that expression, but I accept your sort of the content of what you describe. And Estonia is an excellent example of using lots of innovations. But just from one, we should be very careful not to, a lot of direct democracy type institutions have not worked really well in the past. They are typically easy to hijack by small minorities and so on. The American primaries, by the way, is a prime example of that. Terrible institution that was meant to be a democrat, sort of democratizing, get it out of those closed rooms and spread the nomination to the people. Yeah, well, then you can get Trump, right? That had like a 2% support in the beginning among the population. So we have to be careful about that, and especially in this environment, right? We haven't talked much about the growth of internet and then social media and what that entails. Let me just, it's an unfiltered, unregulated forum for freedom of speech. Everybody thought it would be a democratic revolution. Everybody can speak. Everybody can put their things on the agenda. It's excellent, right? Except the bad guys are also there. And they use it very effectively. I said this to the January 6th Commission during that investigation. Democracy dies with the lies. Democracy cannot survive if a vast majority of the conversation is based on lies, conspiracy theories, fake news, whatever. Just the simplest thing we do in democracy, at least without these innovations, we go and cast a ballot to hold somebody accountable, like a member of the European Parliament. If that political leader, that party, can lie about what they did, they didn't do, and be believed, then what am I voting on? The meaning of that accountability mechanism disappears. We don't need voting anymore. It's fundamental that democracy as a system needs a foundation of truth. And right now, the development in the use of internet as unregulated, unfiltered, is undermining democracy.
Fantastic. Question 1, question 2, question 3. Questions, no comments. Thank you.
I've rehearsed this and it'll hopefully be less than a
Yes.
minute. My name is Alena Kahle. I work for the London Story. My question is directed to Staffan. So our work focuses on EU-India relations and how democracy can be a bit more integrated into that. And I was quite intrigued by your comment, Staffan, that what democracies need to do right now is to be honest with the trade-offs that they make. To say, well, if we're going to ignore human rights violations for the sake of X, Y, Z, be honest about that, because otherwise democracies lose their legitimacy. I wonder whether that is a wise idea, and if the other panelists could give their thoughts on this particular thing, because ultimately the EU in its founding treaties has the obligation to promote democracy, human rights, et cetera, abroad, and its partner countries, such as specifically India, have said the same thing. They have agreed to those values and have agreed to human rights treaties. So if you're going to say, yes, we're making a trade-off and ignoring these treaty violations, does that still make democracies credible? So lovely to hear the thoughts of the other panelists on this, and also more broadly on the distinction between democracy and human rights and how they interlink, but I guess that's too much, so we can discuss that over dinner. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, so much. Question number 2. Yes.
Okay. Hello, my name is Adam. I'm from Poland, and a lot of people in Poland, so much people in Poland as a part of the society are loving democracy since this solidarity movement. Yes, but why all of the European institutions has failed for us with the peace actions with our political party that's ruling at the moment and making the law that isn't for the people, that is for their own wallets and for their own positions, yes. Why there are no actions that really can touch them. Reducement of fundings has touched mostly the people that are forced to handle this, that they don't get the money and cannot have a new hospital and new other things that are planned in the KPO. Aren't there any actions that can Europe make to reduce this type of autocracy?
Thank you. Third question.
Hello, everybody. My name is Mattia Jansel. I'm a student from Leiden University. And actually building on the previous comment of the representative from Finland about the lack of imagination and creativity in building democracies, I would like to challenge the idea, or let's say bias, of discussing politics mainly on in the country level. When, after all, we are here united around a certain European vision, which, however, we discussed that suffers from a certain disconnect from the people and the localities. So my question is, why don't we focus more on cities, actually, and building democracies on urban level way more? Because if, again, borrowing the idea from the keynote speech about autocracies connecting mainly on emotional level, it could be that on the city level, let's say on the neighborhoods level, it is, again, a phrase from one lecture, it is small enough to grasp by the people, but large enough to make a difference. So cities, after all, can be well, the arena for, let's say, the ordinary, the working class, the angry young man in Poland to enjoy, let's say, the experience of democracy and to have a say about the primary environments they live in. So, yeah, basically the question would be, it's more of a, let's say, open-ended, imaginative question. Why don't we delegate more democracy, more power, more decision-making to cities? Because also, after all, we see that it is oftentimes the cities in the autocracies, like let's say Budapest or Warsaw, that are remaining progressive.
Thank you so much. We close the questions. Now we have 10 more minutes until the end. Who wants to pick on any of the questions? Poland. You have Poland and cities, but also we should not forget concerning Europe and demography, rural Europe. So
yes,
we need to think not just about cities.
So maybe I will start from the quote from Václav Havel that there are good grounds for hope, but not for optimism. And I totally feel him.
Thank you.
As I said before, I'm an idealist, and I hated to hear the truth that politics often is about trade-offs. And there are different ways of supporting and saving humanity, and sometimes we have to build alliances with autocrats or other systems that we really don't like. What can we do as Democrats? First of all, we should have hope, because we probably, all of us sitting here, we know that our values are really worth fighting for. Second, we need to fight for them. We, the intellectuals, the opposition, the media, the civil society, we have to persuade the citizens that democracy is the system that allows them to develop and to thrive. Because, as I said, many, especially young people are feeling disillusioned with the system. So democracy, we have to prove that democracy is worthy of its name. As answering the question about what European Union can do to reduce autocratic tendencies, for example, in Poland, and for example in Hungary, I already mentioned that it's a tough thing, this conditionality I was mentioning before. It doesn't work, but what to do? European Union is built on the values of rule of law and liberal democracy, and but we at the same time we saw the anti-democratic backlash of the countries like Poland, like Central Eastern Europe, that shown that we don't want to be imitating others. We don't want to be imitating the West. We want to be sovereign. That's why the sovereignism is the word of too many days. That's why I really believe that the ultimate voice belongs to the opposition, who is also the ultimate check and balance, that really we cannot say that they are external traitors. So it's the work of the opposition working together with, as I said, civil society, intellectuals, the media, and persuading citizens that it's worthwhile to vote for them, but also to have really constructive programs, which they don't have yet, at least in Poland.
Thank you so much. Mr. Lindberg, short answer. You gave your final word, and then we'll go to Mr. Mikser for the final word, because you had a direct question to you. Trade-offs, just short.
Yes, okay, direct question. Yeah, I wasn't really thinking about India when I said that. I was more thinking about the kinds of things when, okay, so let's get off Russian gas. So now we go to Qatar, right? Or Sweden for a long time selling weapons to Saudi Arabia that were also used in the war in Yemen. Well, to keep our industry going, we need to have some clients. I mean, it's more that kind of thing that I was thinking about. I hope that the European and governments and the EU and the US in their relationship to India continue to insist on democratic rights and freedoms and the declines that have happened with civil society, with media, academia, and so on, and of course the treatment of Muslims in India over the past 8 years. So I hope that continues to be brought up.
Thank you. We have a comment from Professor Illouz, and then we go to New Delhi, and then Mr. Mikser will finish. Please.
It's really a question, actually.
No time, sorry for questions. We'll have it on dinner. Just
okay, so then it's a comment.
Okay.
I just...
4 minutes for 3 people, so okay.
So we've been talking about what can be done at the level of civil society, educational programs, etc. I have a tendency to ask also what went wrong in the liberal camp. I think we can find many mistakes that were made. There's only one I want to point at. Karl Popper in Open Society and Its Enemies has a very interesting notion of the paradoxes of tolerance. And he says very briefly that tolerance is paradoxical because if it tolerates if it tolerates the intolerant, it will end up being defeated by the intolerant. And Sylvie Kaufmann from the newspaper Le Monde has been writing, for example, about the mistakes of the West and especially the European Union in ignoring the signals that Putin has been given for a long time about his intentions. And many people who are not privy to the complexities of the decision process in the European Union feel the same way about what happened to Orbán and Poland. That is the idea that they should have been stopped much earlier and that the European Union should have been intolerant in order to protect tolerance. That was going to be a question, but there is no question mark.
But I can have a question. What is European Union? That is also interesting. But New Delhi, please, your final comment. You have 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to add that it's important when you have conversations like this to be more self-reflective than to introduce frames of reference which says that the onus is on the others, but not on yourself. What do I mean by that very quickly is that, I mean, there was a colleague who asked a question on EU-India relations and where does human rights figure when both of them talk about it. I would come back to a point which I said earlier, which I think the audience needs to also think about. Do you always only frame all your conversations about human rights, or do you selectively use human rights when it is suitable, right? Because if that is a constant normative underpinning of the way you do business and politics, it should define every action. But the evidence is contrary. If human rights are so significant, then you would never have undertaken business with Russia. And it's not just about small clients and large clients and the trade-offs. I think it's a fundamental question which says that there is this normative box with which we engage, but we will selectively engage. And then there is the other box where we do business. And that is why I again urge everybody to recognize the binary which is created. Where you talk of the binary of the political between democracy and autocracy, but do not want to consider that everybody is doing business with every other state. And at that point in time, nobody, and I say nobody, is talking about human rights and political values and objectives. It's the balance sheet which is driving politics all the way around.
Thank you very much.
So a
Thank
little
you.
bit more of self-reflection would be a better way to start a discussion.
Thank you so much for your inputs. Mr. Mikser, for your final words.
Yes, thank you. I think on trade-offs, I can't remember if it was Clausewitz or Sun Tzu or someone else who said that tactics is the way you use soldiers and equipment to win a battle, and strategy is the way you use battles to win the war. And I think that when we are doing politics, we always have to keep our eye on the strategic objective. And when I, for example, as an Estonian politician, go to China to talk about human rights, I want to be able to actually achieve change in the human rights situation in China rather than just make a point of speaking my conscience and being kicked out. So I've always tried to be very honest about the trade-offs. Now, after George W. Bush and his 2 wars and his failed attempt to export democracy by force, I think we are not too keen on trying to do that, at least for the time being. So we can only lead by example, and we can only try to convert or reconvert our own people into believers in democracy. And we are, as politicians, we and try to basically give to people a sense of security, economical, physical, and otherwise, emotional also. And people also on the demand side, I think they want justice and respect. We've been, as progressives, pretty good at trying to sell them the concept of economic security. But on the other fronts, I think that we have been recently outdone by populists on the right. And we have to sort of also think of those terrains.
First of all, I want to thank to everyone who watched us online, because this panel was streamed online. So thank you for being with us. Second of all, I want to thank all of you in the room. No one left, so I understand our panel was interesting. Thank you to Professor Ummu Salma Bava. Thank you to Karolina Zbytniewska. Thank you to Sven Mikser. Thank you to Staffan Lindberg for such an inspiring and interesting panel. And we're going to imagine and be creative during the dinner. But before that, I'm asking all of you to join us. Is it on the terrace downstairs, the family photo? Outside for the family photo, and then later for the dinner. Thank you so much for being with us the first day.